The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Music Row in Nashville, Tennessee, turning the brick facades of the legendary recording studios into shades of burnt orange and deep amber. George Strait sat in the leather chair of Conference Room B at MCA Records, his weathered cowboy hat resting on his knee, fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against the armrest. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the bustling street below where musicians carried guitar cases and producers hurried between buildings, all chasing the same dream he'd been pursuing for the past 3 years. Across the mahogany table, 3 men in expensive suits studied him with expressions that ranged from concern to barely concealed impatience. Richard Bennett, the label's senior vice president, was a stocky man in his 50s, whose thinning hair was combed meticulously over his scalp. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and slid a folder across the polished surface toward George. "George, we need to talk about your future with MCA," Bennett began, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who'd had this conversation before. "Your last album, Straight from the Heart, did moderately well. The singles charted, sure. But we're not seeing the crossover appeal we need in today's market." George remained silent, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He'd known this meeting was coming. The signs had been there for months. Fewer promotional dollars, shorter radio tours, the subtle shift in how people at the label greeted him in the hallways. David Morrison, the A&R director, leaned forward with a forced smile. He was younger than Bennett, maybe 40, with slicked-back hair and a tendency to speak in marketing buzzwords. "What Richard is saying is that the industry is changing, George. Kenny Rogers is doing pop ballads. Eddie Rabbitt is on the Billboard Hot 100. Even Willie Nelson is collaborating with artists outside traditional country. The walls between genres are coming down, and that's where the money is." The third man, Leonard Hayes, the label's head of production, had barely spoken since George arrived. He was an older gentleman, probably pushing 70, with kind eyes that seemed to carry decades of music industry wars. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "We've invested a lot in you, son. Your traditional honky-tonk sound is beautiful, authentic. But the market research shows that listeners want something more contemporary. More synthesizers, more polished production, crossover potential." George's fingers stopped drumming. He looked at each man in turn, his blue eyes steady, despite the anxiety churning in his gut. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Bennett opened the folder and pushed several documents forward. "We're offering you one more album under your current contract. But there are conditions. We need you to work with producers who understand the contemporary market. We need songs that can get airplay on adult contemporary stations, not just country. Think urban cowboy soundtrack, not Merle Haggard." The comparison stung more than Bennett probably intended. George had grown up listening to Merle Haggard, George Jones, and Hank Williams. That was the music that spoke to his soul, that told stories about real people facing real problems. The idea of abandoning that for radio-friendly pop, disguised as country, felt like betraying everything he stood for. "And if I don't agree to these conditions?" George asked, though he already knew the answer. Morrison didn't sugarcoat it. "Then we're not renewing your contract when it expires in 6 months. We wish you well, but MCA can't continue investing in an artist whose vision doesn't align with market realities." The room fell silent, except for the muted sounds of traffic from the street below. George felt the weight of the ultimatum settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. He thought about Norma, his high school sweetheart and wife of 13 years, waiting back home in San Marcos, Texas. He thought about their children, Jennifer and George Jr., whose lives had been shaped by his pursuit of this music career. He thought about the mortgage on their modest house, the bills that kept coming regardless of whether his records sold. "Can I have some time to think about this?" George asked, reaching for his hat. Bennett nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't optimistic about George's ability to make the right choice. Take a week. But George, I want you to really consider this. You're 30 years old. You've got talent. You've got presence. You've got that authentic Texas charm that people respond to. Don't let stubbornness about musical purity end your career before it really takes off. There's no shame in evolution. George stood, settling his hat on his head with practiced ease. I appreciate your honesty, gentlemen. I'll give this serious thought. As he left the conference room and walked through the label's corridors, George felt dozens of eyes on him. News traveled fast in this building, and he suspected that most of the staff already knew about the ultimatum. The sympathetic looks from secretaries and the averted gazes from junior executives told him everything he needed to know about what people expected him to do. The February air hit him like a slap when he stepped outside. Nashville winters weren't as harsh as those further north, but there was a damp chill that seeped into your bones. George pulled his jacket tighter and started walking. Not toward his car, but just walking, needing movement to process what had just happened. He found himself on Lower Broadway, where the honky-tonks were already starting to fill up despite the early hour. Music spilled out from every doorway, traditional country, rock, blues, all mixing into a chaotic symphony that somehow represented everything he loved and hated about Nashville. This city was the heart of country music, but it was also where artists came to have their edges smoothed off, their authenticity questioned, their art commodified. George ducked into Tootsie's Orchid Lounge, the legendary bar that had been serving musicians since 1960. The purple walls were covered in signed photographs of country music royalty, a visual history of everyone who'd played here on their way up or down the ladder of success. The bartender, a weathered woman named Helen Rodriguez, who'd been pouring drinks here for 15 years, recognized him immediately. "George Strait," she said with a warm smile, already reaching for a bottle of Lone Star beer. "Don't see you around here much lately. Figured you were too busy being a recording artist to visit us common folk." George managed a smile as he took a seat at the bar. "Never too busy for Tootsies, Helen. This place keeps you humble." She set the beer in front of him and leaned against the bar, her experienced eyes reading his mood like a book. "Rough day. You could say that." George took a long drink, savoring the familiar taste of home. "You ever feel like the world is moving in one direction and you're the only one trying to go the other way?" Helen laughed, a sound rich with understanding. "Honey, I've been serving musicians in this bar for 15 years. That's pretty much the definition of being an artist. The question isn't whether you're going against the grain, it's whether you've got the guts to keep doing it when everyone's telling you you're wrong." Wait. Before George could respond, someone slid onto the stool next to him. "Mind if I join you? You look like a man who could use some company, even if it's from a stranger." George turned to see a man about his age, maybe a year or two younger, with shaggy brown hair and calloused fingers that marked him as a guitar player. He was wearing worn jeans and a flannel shirt, the uniform of session musicians everywhere. "Free country," George said, gesturing to the stool, "though I'm not sure I'm going to be great company right now." The man ordered a whiskey and extended his hand. "Daniel Crawford. I'm a session guitarist, mostly work over at Soundstage Studios. I know who you are, of course." Unwound was on repeat in my truck for about 3 months straight. George shook his hand, genuinely pleased by the compliment. "Thanks, man. I appreciate that." "George Strait, but I guess you already knew that." Daniel nodded, taking a sip of his whiskey. "I was actually at a session earlier today where your name came up. Some producer was talking about how traditional country is dying and used you as an example. Said you were talented but stuck in the past. I almost decked him. George couldn't help but laugh, though there was bitterness in it. Well, you're not the only one who thinks I'm stuck in the past. I just got out of a meeting where my label basically told me to modernize or get dropped. Daniel's expression darkened. Let me guess. They want synthesizers, drum machines, crossover appeal, all that garbage that's turning country music into elevator music with a twang? Pretty much. George found himself warming to this stranger who seemed to understand his frustration. They gave me a week to decide whether I'm willing to compromise my sound for commercial viability. Professional way of saying sell out or get out. What are you going to do? Daniel asked, signaling Helen for another round. George was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs on the wall. There was Willie Nelson, who'd bucked the Nashville establishment and become a legend on his own terms. There was Waylon Jennings, who'd fought his label to make music his way. But there were also dozens of other faces, talented artists who'd faded into obscurity because they couldn't or wouldn't adapt to changing times. I don't know, George admitted. I've got a family depending on me, a mortgage, bills. At what point does artistic integrity become selfishness? At what point am I just being stubborn instead of smart? Daniel leaned back, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Can I tell you something? I moved to Nashville 5 years ago from Detroit. I was playing in rock bands, making decent money, had a steady girlfriend, the whole 9 yards. But I wasn't happy because I was playing music I didn't believe in. So I packed up everything and moved here to chase authentic country music. He paused, taking another drink. Know what I found? The same damn thing I left behind. Producers more concerned with radio formats than soul. Labels more interested in quarterly profits than artistic legacy. I ended up as a session musician playing on records I can barely stand to hear on the radio. But you know what keeps me going? What? George asked. The hope that someday, someone with actual star power will have the guts to stand up and say no to all this corporate nonsense. Someone who'll prove that you can be commercially successful and artistically authentic. I thought maybe you could be that person, George. Your voice, your style, everything about you is genuine. That's rare as hell in this town. George felt the weight of Daniel's words settle on him. Here was a stranger, someone who'd walked away from everything for the same principles George was being asked to abandon, telling him that his choice mattered beyond just his own career. It's easy to say, stand your ground when you're not the one who might lose everything, George said quietly. True enough, Daniel conceded, but it's also easy to compromise when you tell yourself it's just this once. Then it's one more time. Then it's who you are. I've seen it happen to too many good artists. They wake up one day and don't recognize themselves or their music anymore. Before George could respond, a commotion near the stage drew their attention. A young woman was arguing with the bar's booking manager, her voice rising above the ambient noise. She was probably in her mid-20s, with shoulder-length auburn hair and an expression of frustrated determination that George immediately recognized. It was the look of someone fighting for something they believed in. I'm telling you, these songs are good, she was saying, clutching a notebook to her chest. Just give me 10 minutes to showcase them. If your audience doesn't respond, I'll leave and never bother you again. The booking manager, a heavy-set man named Rick Patterson, who George had met a few times, shook his head dismissively. Look, sweetheart, I've got enough problems without adding amateur hour to the lineup. Come back when you've got some actual credits. The woman's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Amateur? I've been writing songs since I was 12 years old. I've studied everyone from Loretta Lynn to Dolly Parton. Just because I haven't had a hit yet doesn't mean I have time for this, Rick interrupted, already turning away. Good luck out there. George watched as the woman stood there, deflated, clutching her notebook like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the ground. He saw himself in her, the rejection, the dismissal, the feeling that talent didn't matter if you didn't fit the right mold. Without thinking it through, George stood and walked over to her. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I couldn't help but overhear. You write songs?" The woman looked up at him, and he saw tears threatening at the corners of her eyes that she was desperately trying to hold back. Recognition flickered across her face. "You're George Strait. I've got your albums." "Well then, you've got good taste," George said with a smile. "I'm George. And you are?" "Jennifer Hayes," she said, shaking his hand. Her grip was firm despite her obvious distress. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make a scene. I just thought maybe if I could get my songs heard somewhere, anywhere." "I know that feeling," George said. "Tell you what, why don't you come sit with us? My friend Daniel over there is a session guitarist, and I'm always looking for good material. No promises, but I'd be willing to listen to what you've got." Jennifer's face transformed, hope replacing despair in an instant. "Really? You'd do that?" "Why not?" George said, surprising himself with his own words. Here he was, facing the biggest decision of his career, and he was offering to help a complete stranger. But something about Jennifer's determination, her refusal to back down despite rejection, resonated with him. Maybe it was a reminder of why he'd gotten into music in the first place. They returned to the bar, where Daniel had watched the entire exchange with an amused expression. "Making friends?" he asked. "Daniel Crawford, meet Jennifer Hayes," George said as they sat down. "Jennifer writes songs and is looking for someone to listen." Jennifer pulled out her notebook, her hands shaking slightly with nervous energy. "I don't have fancy demos or anything, just lyrics and basic melodies. I usually play them on my guitar, but I left it in my car." "That's fine," Daniel said, his professional interest piqued. "Sometimes the rawest form is the truest form." "What kind of songs do you write?" "Stories, mostly," Jennifer said, flipping through her notebook. "Real stories about real people. Broken relationships, lost dreams, small-town struggles. The kind of stuff that happens to everyone, but nobody writes songs about anymore because it's not commercial enough." George and Daniel exchanged glances. Without words, they both recognized they'd found someone who understood what they were fighting for. "Read us something," George said. Jennifer hesitated, then settled on a page marked with coffee stains and crossed-out words. She began to read, her voice soft at first, but gaining strength as she went. The song was about a factory worker in a dying town, choosing between chasing dreams and staying to take care of aging parents. The lyrics were simple but powerful, painting vivid pictures without resorting to clichés. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Daniel let out a low whistle. "Damn, that's good. That's really good." George nodded in agreement. "You've got something special there, Jennifer. That's the kind of song that sticks with you. Makes you think about your own choices." Jennifer's eyes welled up again, but this time with relief and validation. "You really think so?" "Because every publisher I've sent demos to says my stuff is too depressing, too specific, too traditional. They want party songs and love songs that sound like every other love song." "Sounds familiar," George said dryly. He made a decision in that moment, one that surprised even himself. "Jennifer, I'm working on something. I don't know if it's going to pan out, but I might need songs that sound exactly like what you just read. Would you be interested in collaborating?" Jennifer's mouth fell open. "Are you serious? With you? But you're on MCA Records. You're a real artist." "Real artists help each other out," George said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was committing to. The ultimatum from MCA was still hanging over his head. unresolved and threatening. But something about this chance meeting felt significant, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "Give me your number. Let me think about some things, and I'll call you in a few days." Jennifer wrote her information on a napkin with shaking hands, still seeming unable to believe this was happening. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to me." After Jennifer left, energized and hopeful in a way she probably hadn't felt in months, Daniel turned to George with a knowing smile. "You realize what you just did? You gave that girl hope? Now you're going to have to follow through." "I know," George said, staring at the napkin with Jennifer's phone number. "Maybe that's exactly what I needed. A reminder that there are people out there who still believe in the music I want to make." "So what's the plan?" Daniel asked. "You going to tell MCA to shove their ultimatum and go down swinging?" George finished his beer, feeling something shift inside him. It wasn't quite resolved yet, but it was the beginning of something. "I don't know yet, but I'm starting to think that maybe the question isn't whether I can afford to say no to them. Maybe the question is whether I can afford to say yes." They talked for another hour, trading stories about the music industry's absurdities and their shared frustrations with the direction country music was taking. By the time George finally headed to his car, the sun had set completely, and Broadway was alive with neon lights and the sounds of music pouring from every venue. During the 3-hour drive back to San Marcos, George's mind raced through scenarios and possibilities. What if he did reject MCA's demands? What would that look like? Could he survive without a major label? Were there alternative paths he hadn't considered? He pulled into his driveway just after 11. The lights were still on in the house, and he could see Norma's silhouette moving past the kitchen window. She'd waited up for him, like she always did when he had meetings in Nashville. George sat in his truck for a moment, gathering his thoughts. How was he going to explain this to her? Norma had supported his music career from the beginning, through the lean years when money was tight and success seemed like a distant dream. She'd believed in him when he barely believed in himself, but asking her to trust him through another risky decision felt like too much to ask. He finally got out of the truck and walked up to the house. Before he could reach for the door handle, it opened. Norma stood there in her robe, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her expression concerned but loving. "I was getting worried," she said, pulling him into a hug. "How did it go?" George held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her lavender shampoo. "It was complicated. Can we talk?" They sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee, while George recounted the meeting with MCA, the ultimatum, and his evening at Tootsie's. Norma listened without interrupting, her face revealing nothing of what she was thinking. She'd developed that skill over years of being married to a musician, the ability to hear difficult news without immediate reaction. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee absently. "What do you want to do?" she finally asked. "I don't know," George admitted. "Part of me thinks they're right. Maybe I am being stubborn. Maybe I should just take the deal, make some commercial albums, secure our future. But Norma, when I think about making music I don't believe in, it feels like dying slowly." Norma reached across the table and took his hand. "George, I didn't marry you because I thought you were going to make us rich. I married you because you're the most honest, authentic person I've ever known. That hasn't changed just because some executives think they know better. But what about the kids? The house? What if I make the wrong choice and we lose everything?" "We've been poor before," Norma said simply. "We survived. What I don't think we'd survive is you turning into someone you're not. I see it in your eyes every time you come home from Nashville lately. You're losing yourself, George. That scares me more than losing the house." George felt emotion welling up in his chest. "I met this songwriter tonight, Jennifer Hayes. She's been fighting to get her songs heard, getting rejected everywhere because they're too traditional. And I saw myself in her, you know? Fighting for something that everyone says doesn't matter anymore. I told her I might want to work with her. Then maybe you already know what you need to do, Norma said. They talked until well past midnight, exploring possibilities and facing fears. By the time they finally went to bed, George didn't have all the answers, but he had something more valuable. The certainty that whatever choice he made, his wife would stand beside him. The next morning, George called his manager, Robert Palmer, a shrewd businessman who'd been with him since his first recording contract. Robert listened to George's account of the MCA meeting with increasing concern. "George, I'm not going to lie to you," Robert said, his Texas drawl somehow making even bad news sound almost pleasant. "If you walk away from MCA without a deal, you're taking a huge risk. There aren't many labels out there willing to take a chance on traditional country right now. You could end up playing honky-tonks for the rest of your life." "But what if there's another way?" George asked. "What if instead of going to them, I bring them something they can't refuse?" "I'm listening," Robert said cautiously. An idea had been forming in George's mind since his conversation with Daniel and Jennifer. "What if I put together a showcase? Not in some label conference room where executives can nitpick everything. A real live performance in front of a real audience. Show them that traditional country still connects with people." "Where are you thinking?" Robert asked. "The Ryman Auditorium," George said, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. "The mother church of country music. If I'm going to make a statement about traditional country, there's no better place to do it." Robert was quiet for so long that George thought the call had dropped. "George, do you have any idea how hard it is to book the Ryman? And even if you could, you're talking about putting on a show with no label support, no promotional machine. You'd be funding everything yourself." "I know," George said, "but I also know that I can't make a decision about my future based on fear. I need to know if what I believe in can still work. If traditional country can still fill seats and move hearts. If I'm going to compromise, I at least want to know what I'm compromising for." Robert sighed, but George could hear the hint of excitement in his voice. "You're either crazy or brilliant. Maybe both. Give me a few days to see what I can set up. But George, this could either save your career or end it. There's no middle ground here." "I understand," George said. "No middle ground." The first week of March brought warmer weather to San Marcos, with blue bonnets starting to dot the hillsides and the Blanco River running clear and cold from recent rains. George stood on his back porch, guitar in hand, working through chord progressions while watching his kids play in the yard. Jennifer was 9 now, George Jr., almost 7. And they were at that perfect age where everything was possible and nothing seemed impossible. Robert had called 2 days ago with cautiously good news. Through a series of connections and favors, he'd managed to secure a tentative booking at the Ryman Auditorium for the second week of May. It wasn't officially confirmed yet. They needed to prove they could sell enough tickets to make it worthwhile. But it was a start. The venue would hold about 2,300 people. George would need to fill at least 75% of those seats to break even. And that was assuming he could keep costs minimal. "You look like you're carrying the weight of Texas on your shoulders," Norma said, stepping out onto the porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed him one and settled into the chair beside him. "Just thinking about everything that has to happen in the next 2 months," George said. "Find musicians willing to work for almost nothing. Rehearse a full set. Somehow promote this show without label backing. And write new material that's good enough to prove traditional country isn't dead." "Sounds impossible when you list it like that," Norma said with a slight smile. "Good thing you've never let impossible stop you before." George's phone rang. the sound jarring in the peaceful morning. It was Daniel Crawford. "George, I've been thinking about your Ryman idea," Daniel said, his voice energized. "I talked to some guys I work with at the studio. Session players who are damn good but stuck playing on records they hate. I told them what you're trying to do. And man, they're interested. Real interested." George felt a spark of hope. "Yeah? How many are we talking about?" "Well, there's me on lead guitar. Then there's Vincent Palmer on steel guitar. Guy's got hands like magic. Anthony Richards plays bass. Been in Nashville for 15 years and never gets to do anything creative. And Rebecca Turner on fiddle. Graduated from Berkeley, but ended up playing country because that's where the work is. All of them would rather play traditional country than the pop stuff they're stuck with." "That's incredible," George said, his mind already imagining how they'd sound together. "But Daniel, I've got to be honest with you. I can't pay much. This whole thing is being funded out of my own pocket, and I'm not exactly swimming in cash." "We figured," Daniel said. "Here's what we propose. You pay us a token amount for rehearsals and the show. Nothing fancy. But if this works out, if you get a deal out of it, we want first consideration for studio work on your next album. We want to be part of something real, George. That's payment enough." George had to take a moment to compose himself. "Daniel, I don't know what to say. Why would you all take that risk?" "Because someone has to," Daniel said simply. "Look, we're all at a point where we either accept that music is just a job, or we make one last stand for what we believe in. You're giving us that chance. Besides, from what I hear, you're putting everything on the line too. Seems only fair, we're all in it together." After they hung up, George sat for a long moment, processing what had just happened. 4 professional musicians willing to bet on him, on his vision, on the belief that traditional country still mattered. The weight on his shoulders didn't lighten, but it felt more bearable knowing he wasn't carrying it alone. He called Jennifer Hayes next. She answered on the second ring, her voice breathless like she'd run to catch the phone. "Jennifer, it's George Strait. Do you have time to talk about those songs?" "For you? I've got all the time in the world," she said. George explained his plan for the Ryman show, leaving out some of the more terrifying details about funding and ticket sales. "I need material that tells stories, real stories about real people. The kind of songs that remind folks why country music matters. Think you can help with that?" Jennifer's enthusiasm was palpable even through the phone. "I've got a whole notebook full of songs nobody wants. When can we start?" "How about Thursday? Come down to San Marcos, and we'll work through what you've got." Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Jennifer would drive down from Nashville every few days, bringing songs she'd written or ideas she wanted to develop. They'd sit at George's kitchen table or on the back porch, working through lyrics and melodies. Norma often contributing her own observations about which stories resonated most deeply. Jennifer was a revelation. Her songs had a raw honesty that cut through all the polish and production that dominated contemporary country. One song, Highways and Heartaches, told the story of a long-haul trucker torn between life on the road and the family waiting at home. Another, Small Town Saturday Night, captured the bittersweet nostalgia of youth in a place where nothing ever changed. "Where do you get these stories?" George asked during one session, impressed by the specificity of her details. Jennifer shrugged. "I grew up in a little town in Kentucky called Bardstown. Population about 6,000. My dad worked at a bourbon distillery. My mom was a school teacher. I spent my whole childhood watching people struggle with ordinary problems. Not dramatic stuff, just life. Trying to make ends meet. Trying to keep families together. Trying to find meaning in routines. That's what's missing from so much of what's on the radio now." George said. "Everything's either a party song or a generic love song. Nobody's writing about the actual texture of life anymore." "Well, that's what labels say doesn't sell," Jennifer said with a bitter edge to her voice. "They want escapism, not reality." "Maybe," George said. "Or maybe they've forgotten that the best escape is feeling understood, hearing your own story in a song." Meanwhile, Daniel was organizing rehearsals. He'd found a small practice space in Austin, about an hour from San Marcos, where they could work without interruption. George drove up for their first full band rehearsal on a Thursday evening, nervous about how the chemistry would work. The practice space was in an old warehouse district, the kind of area that was slowly gentrifying, but still retained its working-class roots. George found the right building and climbed the stairs to the second floor, following the sound of instruments being tuned. When he opened the door, Daniel was adjusting his guitar, while 3 other people sorted through equipment. Daniel made the introductions. Vincent Palmer was tall and lean, probably in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a ponytail. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent years on the road before settling into session work. His steel guitar case was covered in stickers from honky-tonks across Texas and Oklahoma. Anthony Richards was stockier, with a thick black beard and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a professorial appearance. He held his bass like it was an extension of his body, fingers unconsciously plucking out a walking blues line even as he shook George's hand. Rebecca Turner was younger than the others, maybe 28, with bright red hair and a spray of freckles across her nose. Her fiddle case looked older than she was, the leather worn and cracked. When she opened it, George saw an instrument that had clearly been played for generations. "That's beautiful," George said, nodding at the fiddle. Rebecca smiled, running her fingers lovingly across the wood. "It was my grandmother's. She played bluegrass in Kentucky before women were really welcome in those circles. Figured if she could fight for her music in the 1940s, I can do it now." They started with a standard George had recorded before, "Amarillo by Morning," just to get a feel for each other's playing. George counted off, and they began. Magic happened immediately. Vincent's steel guitar wept and soared, adding emotional depth to every phrase. Anthony's bass provided a solid, rolling foundation that drove the song forward without overpowering it. Rebecca's fiddle danced around George's vocals, complementing without competing. And Daniel's guitar work tied it all together with clean, precise licks that honored the song's traditional roots while adding his own subtle touches. When they finished, there was a moment of stunned silence. Then Daniel let out a whoop. "That's what I'm talking about. That's the sound right there." They worked for 4 hours that night, running through George's existing material and then tackling some of Jennifer's new songs. With each song, they grew tighter, more intuitive about each other's instincts. There was a chemistry that couldn't be manufactured, a shared understanding of what they were trying to achieve. During a break, Vincent pulled George aside. "I want you to know something. I've been playing music for 30 years now. Started when I was 12 in a honky-tonk in Lubbock. I've played with legends, and I've played with hacks. What we've got here, this is special. This is the real deal." "It feels that way," George agreed. "But we've got a lot of work ahead of us. 2 months to put together a show that could either validate everything we believe or prove the label's right." "Then we better make it count," Vincent said. As March progressed, the reality of what George was attempting began to sink in. Robert called with regular updates on ticket sales. They were moving, but slowly. Without major label promotion, they were relying on word of mouth, local radio interviews, and whatever buzz they could generate through grassroots efforts. "We're at about 40% capacity," Robert reported in late March. "That's not terrible for an independent show, but we need to pick up momentum, or this is going to be a financial disaster." George had already invested nearly $15,000 of his own money into deposits, rehearsal space, and basic promotion. It was money he couldn't really afford to lose. But every time doubt crept in, he'd think about the music they were creating in that Austin warehouse. And he knew he couldn't stop now. The real crisis came in early April. George received a call from Richard Bennett at MCA. "George, we need to talk," Bennett said without preamble. "We've been hearing rumors about this Ryman show you're planning. What's going on?" George's heart sank. He'd known this conversation was inevitable, but he'd hoped to have more time. "I'm putting together a showcase. Traditional country? Live performance? I want to show what the music can do when it's done right. Without label involvement," Bennett said flatly. "Without consulting us. George, you're still under contract with MCA. Any performances need to be cleared through us." "It's not a commercial performance," George countered, though he knew this was shaky legal ground. "It's more like an audition, showing what I'm capable of." Bennett's voice hardened. "Don't play games with me. You're trying to prove a point, and you're using MCA resources, our publicity, our radio relationships, to do it. That's not how this works." "I haven't used any MCA resources," George said, his own anger rising. "I've funded everything myself, found my own musicians, done my own promotion. I've followed the letter of my contract." "Maybe," Bennett conceded. "But here's the reality. You're creating a situation where you either succeed spectacularly and make us look like fools for doubting you, or you fail spectacularly and damage our investment in your career. Either way, it's not good for our relationship. With all due respect, sir, our relationship is already pretty damaged," George said. "You gave me an ultimatum: change my sound or lose my deal. I'm exploring my options. That's just good business." "Fine," Bennett said coldly. "But understand this. If this Ryman show doesn't work out, don't expect MCA to be there to catch you. You're on your own." The call left George shaken. He'd burned a bridge, possibly irrevocably. If the show failed, he'd have no label, no support system, and a mountain of debt. He'd be starting over from scratch at 30 years old. That evening, the whole band gathered at George's house for what had become their weekly planning session. Norma had made a pot of chili and cornbread, and they sat around the dining room table like old friends rather than business associates. George told them about the call from Bennett. "I need you all to know what we're up against. This isn't just about music anymore. It's about whether I'll have a career after May. If you want to back out, I understand. I don't want to drag anyone down with me." Rebecca spoke up first. "I'm in. I didn't come to Nashville to play it safe." "Same here," Anthony said. "Besides, I've already told my session work contacts that I'm booked for May. Might as well make it count for something meaningful." Vincent and Daniel nodded their agreement. Jennifer, who'd been working more closely with them on arrangements, raised her glass of sweet tea. "To going down swinging." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," George said, but he raised his own glass to meet theirs. They worked late into the night, refining their set list. They'd opened strong with Unwound, one of George's early hits, to establish immediate credibility. Then they'd introduce newer material from Jennifer's catalog, songs that would showcase the range and depth of traditional country storytelling. They'd mix in some carefully chosen standards, songs that everyone knew but would hear in a new way with their arrangements. The show needed to be more than just good music. It needed to be a statement, a manifesto, proof that traditional country could be commercially viable and artistically satisfying. Every song choice mattered. Every arrangement had to be perfect. As April progressed, George found himself living in two worlds. During the day, he was a husband and father, helping his kids with homework and maintaining the house. But nights and weekends belonged to music. Rehearsals in Austin, songwriting sessions with Jennifer, Late-night phone calls with Robert about ticket sales and logistics. Norma watched it all with a mixture of pride and concern. "You're running yourself ragged," she said one night after he'd returned from a particularly grueling 8-hour rehearsal. "Just for another month," George said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Win or lose, the demands of a music career wouldn't ease up. "How are the kids handling it?" "They miss you," Norma said honestly, "but they also see you fighting for something you believe in. That's a lesson worth learning." The second week of April brought a breakthrough. George had arranged for a local radio station, KVET, in Austin, to interview him about the upcoming show. The DJ, Brian Mitchell, was a longtime supporter of traditional country and had been one of the few programmers consistently playing George's music. "So, George, you're putting on this big show at the Ryman," Brian said on air. "No label backing, no major promotion. Why go to all this trouble?" George chose his words carefully. "Because I believe traditional country music matters. I believe there's still an audience out there hungry for authentic stories, real emotions, songs that reflect their actual lives. The industry keeps telling us that people want something else, but I'm not convinced. I think if we give them the real thing, they'll respond." "That's a bold statement," Brian said. "You're essentially challenging the entire Nashville establishment." "Not challenging," George corrected. "Just offering an alternative. A reminder of what country music was before it started trying to be something else." The interview generated more buzz than expected. Other radio stations picked up clips, and calls started coming in from as far away as Oklahoma and Louisiana. People wanting to know how they could get tickets. Within a week, ticket sales had jumped to 65% of capacity. "We might actually pull this off," Robert said, the relief evident in his voice. But the momentum brought its own pressures. With more attention came higher expectations. The show wasn't just a showcase anymore, it was becoming an event, a referendum on whether traditional country had a future. During a rehearsal in late April, exhaustion and stress finally caught up with them. They were working on one of Jennifer's newer songs, a ballad called "The Last Dance," when Anthony stopped playing mid-verse. "This isn't working," he said, frustration clear in his voice. "The tempo's dragging, George's vocals are getting lost in the arrangement, and I feel like we're trying too hard to make it something it's not." "What are you suggesting?" Daniel asked, defensive. "We've been working on this arrangement for weeks." "I'm suggesting maybe we're overthinking it," Anthony shot back. "We're so worried about proving a point that we're strangling the life out of the music." The room went silent. George set down his guitar and rubbed his eyes. They were all tired, all feeling the pressure of what they were attempting. Rebecca finally spoke up. "He's right. We've gotten so focused on making a statement that we've forgotten the most important thing. The music has to come first. The message should be in the music itself, not something we're forcing onto it." George nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right. I think we all need to take a step back. Maybe take a couple days off, clear our heads, remember why we're doing this." They agreed to suspend rehearsals for the rest of the week. George drove home that night feeling defeated, wondering if they were in over their heads. But sometimes clarity comes from stepping away. On Saturday morning, George was on his porch with his guitar, just playing for himself without any agenda or pressure. Jennifer came out and sat beside him. "Dad, can you play that song about the cowboy?" she asked. George knew she meant Amarillo by Morning. He played it softly, and Jennifer hummed along, having heard it enough times to know the melody. When he finished, she looked at him with serious 9-year-old eyes. "That's my favorite song," she said. "It makes me feel things." "What kind of things?" George asked, curious. "Happy and sad at the same time. Like when you're remembering something good, but you know it's gone. Does that make sense?" George pulled his daughter close. "That makes perfect sense, sweetheart. That's exactly what good music should do. And in that moment, he understood what Anthony and Rebecca had been trying to tell him. The music itself was the message. They didn't need to force anything or prove anything beyond what the songs naturally conveyed. Trust the material. Trust the performance. Trust the audience to hear what was real. He called the band and Jennifer, asking them to come to his house on Sunday for a different kind of rehearsal. When they arrived, he'd set up on the back porch, facing the yard and the rolling hills beyond. "Here's what we're going to do," George said. "We're going to play like we're at a backyard barbecue, not a showcase. No pressure, no agenda, just music for the sake of music. And we're going to remember what drew us to these songs in the first place." They played for hours that afternoon, laughing between songs, taking breaks to eat Norma's potato salad and drink cold beer. The kids ran around the yard, occasionally stopping to listen. And somewhere in that relaxed, joyful atmosphere, they rediscovered the magic. The last dance transformed. Instead of an overwrought arrangement, it became simple and heartfelt. Jennifer's lyrics about a couple's final evening together before life pulled them apart hit harder with spare instrumentation and George's unadorned vocals. "That's it," Vincent said when they finished. "That's the version we should do." They returned to formal rehearsals the following week with renewed energy and focus. The music flowed more naturally, the arrangements felt organic rather than constructed. They were ready. With 2 weeks left before the show, ticket sales crossed the 80% threshold. The Ryman performance was going to happen, and it was going to be full. Now, all they had to do was deliver. The first week of May brought the kind of weather that reminded George why he loved Texas. Clear skies, temperatures in the mid-70s, and a breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and new grass. But George barely noticed. He was consumed by the 1,000 details that demanded attention as the Ryman show approached. He'd driven to Nashville 3 days ago, checking into a modest hotel near Music Row. The band would arrive throughout the week, and they had 3 days of intensive rehearsals, scheduled at a practice space Daniel had secured. But before any of that, George had a meeting with Robert that he'd been dreading. They met at a coffee shop on 16th Avenue South, the heart of Music Row. Robert was already there when George arrived. 2 coffees on the table, and an expression that suggested bad news. "Give it to me straight," George said, sliding into the booth. Robert pulled out a folder. "Financially, we're in better shape than I expected. Ticket sales have pushed us past break-even. You'll come out a few thousand ahead, maybe more depending on merchandise sales. That's the good news. And the bad? MCA sent a formal letter yesterday. They're not renewing your contract when it expires next month. They're framing it as mutual decision. But George, they're cutting you loose. The Ryman Show is your swan song with a major label." George had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the gut. Did they cite specific reasons? The usual corporate speak about artistic differences and market positioning, Robert said. But reading between the lines, you pissed them off by going around them with this showcase. They see it as disrespectful, a breach of trust. I was supposed to just roll over and let them turn me into someone I'm not? George's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from other customers. "Hey, I'm on your side," Robert said calmly. "But we need to be realistic about what comes next. There aren't a lot of labels interested in traditional country right now. You're going to have to convince someone that you're worth the risk." "That's what the Ryman Show is for," George said. "Maybe," Robert conceded. "But, George, you need to understand the pressure you're under. This isn't just a performance anymore. Industry people are going to be watching, judging, looking for any reason to confirm their belief that traditional country is dead. One wrong note, one empty seat, one moment that doesn't land, they'll use it as evidence that they were right all along. "Thanks for the pep talk," George said dryly. Robert leaned forward. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to prepare you. This is your shot. Maybe your only shot. Make it count." After Robert left, George sat alone with his coffee, watching the industry professionals hurry past outside. How many of them knew about his show? How many were quietly rooting for him to fail so they could feel validated in their own compromises? He thought about calling Norma, but decided against it. She'd hear the stress in his voice, and she had enough to worry about with the kids and the house. Instead, he walked, wandering through the streets of Nashville, trying to clear his head. He found himself at the Ryman Auditorium, standing across the street and staring at the building that had launched so many legends. The red brick facade looked almost sacred in the afternoon light. In less than 2 weeks, he'd be on that stage. Everything he believed in on display. "Impressive, isn't it?" a voice said beside him. George turned to find a man about 60 years old, distinguished-looking with silver hair and kind eyes. He looked vaguely familiar, but George couldn't place him. "Sorry, I don't think we've met," George said. "George Strait." The man smiled. "I know who you are. I'm Frank Sullivan. I used to produce records back in the 60s and 70s. Worked with Ernest Tubb, Ray Price, even a young Willie Nelson before he went to Atlantic." Recognition clicked. Frank Sullivan was a legend, one of the last of the old-school producers who'd helped define the Nashville sound while keeping traditional country alive. "Mr. Sullivan, it's an honor. I grew up listening to the records you made." "Call me Frank," he said, still looking at the Ryman. "I heard about your showcase. Word gets around in this town. Traditional country, no label backing, everything on the line. That's either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," George admitted. Frank chuckled. "You know, I've been in this business for 40 years. I've seen trends come and go. Urban cowboy, outlaw country, the Nashville sound, countrypolitan. Every few years, someone declares that the old way is dead, and the future is something else. And you know what? Sometimes they're right. But sometimes they forget that the best music doesn't follow trends. It creates them." "Is there a point to this history lesson?" George asked, not unkindly. "The point is that you're not the first person to take a stand for traditional country. And you won't be the last. Willie did it. Waylon did it. They paid a price, but they also changed the game. The question is whether you're willing to pay that price." "I don't have much choice," George said. "I'm already all in." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good, because half measures don't work in this town. You either believe completely or you don't believe at all." He pulled out a business card and handed it to George. "I'm mostly retired now, but I still have connections. If your show goes well, call me. Maybe I can help." After Frank left, George felt marginally better. At least someone from the old guard was in his corner. He headed back to his hotel to prepare for the band's arrival. Daniel showed up first, driving in from Nashville with his equipment crammed into a beaten-up van. He looked tired but excited, the kind of pre-performance energy that George remembered from his early touring days. "Ready for this?" Daniel asked as they unloaded guitars. "Ask me again after opening night," George said. Rebecca and Anthony arrived together the next morning, having carpooled from an early session job. Vincent came in from a quick gig in Memphis, still wearing the stage clothes from the night before. Jennifer was already in Nashville, having moved there full-time 2 weeks ago in anticipation of whatever came next. Their first rehearsal in the Nashville space was different from the relaxed practices in Austin. The reality of the Ryman loomed over everything, adding weight to each note. They were professional and focused, but George could sense the tension underneath. "Let's take 5, he said, after they'd run through the opening numbers. "Everyone grab some water. clear your heads." Jennifer pulled him aside. "George, I need to tell you something. I got a call from a publisher yesterday. Someone heard I was involved with your showcase, and they want to meet after the performance. If it goes well, they might be interested in signing me." "That's great news," George said, genuinely pleased. "You deserve it." "But it also means I'm nervous as hell," Jennifer admitted. "What if we mess up? What if the songs don't land? I've been waiting for a break like this for 5 years. I don't know if I'll get another chance." George understood exactly what she was feeling. "Jennifer, we're all carrying that weight. But here's what I've learned. The pressure only ruins the music if you let it. We know these songs are good. We know the arrangements work. Now we just have to trust that and let the music speak for itself." "Easy to say, harder to do," Jennifer said. "True," George agreed. "But we don't have another option." They pushed through the afternoon, working on transitions and polish. By evening, they were exhausted but satisfied. The music was ready. Now they just needed to deliver it. That night, George met with venue staff at the Ryman to go over technical details. The stage manager, a woman named Patricia Donovan, who'd worked at the Ryman for 20 years, walked him through the space. "You've got a good time slot," Patricia said. "Friday night, second week of May. People are ready for the weekend, more receptive to taking chances on something new. Stage setup is straightforward. You'll have about an hour for sound check on Friday afternoon." George looked out at the rows of wooden pews that served as seating. This place has so much history. Everyone from Hank Williams to Johnny Cash has stood on this stage. "That's right," Patricia said. "And you know what? Every single one of them was nervous their first time here. The Ryman has a way of humbling even the biggest stars, but it also has a way of elevating performances. There's something about this room. The acoustics, the history. When it's right, magic happens. And when it's wrong?" George asked. "Then it's very publicly wrong," Patricia said with brutal honesty. "But I wouldn't worry too much. I've seen your rehearsal notes. You've got good material and a solid band. Just remember to breathe and connect with the audience. They're on your side." The next few days blurred together. More rehearsals, more meetings, more details that needed attention. George did phone interviews with local media, trying to build buzz without overpromising. He met with the merchandise vendor about T-shirts and programs. He coordinated with Robert about comp tickets for industry people and press. Through it all, doubt gnawed at him. What if they'd miscalculated? What if traditional country really was as dead as everyone claimed? What if he was leading this entire team toward public humiliation and financial ruin? On Wednesday, 3 days before the show, George called home. Norma answered on the first ring. "How's it going?" she asked. He could hear the kids arguing about something in the background, the comforting sounds of domestic life. "Honestly, I'm terrified," George admitted. "We're as prepared as we're going to be, but there are so many variables. What if—" "Stop," Norma interrupted gently. "You're spiraling. I can hear it in your voice. Listen to me. You've already won. You've put together a band of talented people who believe in what you're doing. You've written songs that matter. You've sold 2,800 tickets to people who want to hear real country music. That's not nothing, George. That's everything. But if the industry people don't respond, then they don't respond," Norma said firmly. "But you'll know you tried. You'll know you didn't compromise. And our kids will grow up knowing their father stood up for what he believed in. That matters more than any record deal." After they hung up, George felt steadier. Norma had always been his anchor, the voice of reason when his own thoughts spiraled out of control. Thursday brought the arrival of some unexpected guests. Frank Sullivan called to say he was coming to the show and bringing friends, other producers and industry veterans who remembered when country music told stories instead of chasing pop trends. "You've got people watching, George," Frank said. "Don't let the pressure get to you. Just do what you do." That evening, the whole band gathered for dinner at a barbecue place near the hotel. They needed this, a chance to be together without the pressure of rehearsal, to remember they were friends and collaborators, not just musicians hired for a job. "I want to say something," George said after they'd ordered. "Tomorrow is going to be intense. There's going to be pressure and nerves and 1,000 things that could go wrong. But I want you all to know that regardless of what happens, I'm proud of what we've built here. This has been about more than just one show. It's been about proving to ourselves that this music still matters." "Damn right it matters," Vincent said, raising his beer. "To traditional country and everyone who still believes in it." They clinked glasses, and for a moment, the anxiety lifted. They were in this together, and that counted for something. Friday morning arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that seemed designed for new beginnings. George woke early, too wired to sleep, and went for a walk through downtown Nashville. The city was just waking up, delivery trucks making their rounds, early commuters heading to work. He found himself back at the Ryman, standing across the street once again. In 12 hours, he'd be on that stage. Everything he'd worked for, everything he believed in, would be put to the test. His phone rang. It was Robert. "Final ticket count, 250 sold. You've got a full house, George. Standing room only." George felt his chest tighten with emotion. "A full house. That's right. People want to see this. They want to believe in what you're doing. Now you just have to deliver." The band arrived at the Ryman at 2 p.m. for sound check. Walking into the empty venue was surreal. The wooden pews stretched back into shadows, and the stage seemed both massive and intimate at the same time. They spent 2 hours fine-tuning everything. Levels, monitor mixes, lighting cues. Patricia supervised with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, making adjustments and offering suggestions. When they finally ran through a few songs, the acoustics were everything George had hoped for. His voice carried naturally, supported by the band's tight arrangements. The room itself seemed to add warmth and depth to their sound. "This is going to work," Daniel said, as they packed up to head back to the hotel for a brief rest. "I can feel it." George wanted to believe him, but the butterflies in his stomach were morphing into eagles. In 5 hours, everything would be decided. Back at the hotel, George tried to nap, but couldn't. He showered, dressed in his best Western shirt and pressed jeans, spent too long fussing with his hair. Finally, unable to sit still any longer, he headed back to the Ryman early. The venue was already coming alive. Staff members moved efficiently through their preparations, and early arrivals were starting to form a line outside. George slipped in through the stage door, finding a quiet corner backstage to gather his thoughts. Jennifer found him there, looking pale but determined in a simple blue dress. "You okay?" she asked. "Ask me in 3 hours," George said. "You?" "Terrified," she admitted, "but also excited. This is what we've been working toward." The rest of the band arrived, and they huddled in the green room, going over last-minute details. Vincent led them in a prayer, asking for steady hands and open hearts. Then it was time. At 7:45, Patricia knocked on the door. 15 minutes. House is full. People are excited. Time to give them a show. They made their way to the stage wings. George could hear the crowd noise, hundreds of conversations creating a buzz of anticipation. He peeked out and saw every seat filled. People standing at the back, the energy palpable. "This is it," Daniel said beside him. "No going back now. Wouldn't want to, even if we could," George replied. At exactly 8 p.m., the house lights dimmed. The crowd noise swelled, then quieted to expectant silence. George took a deep breath, offered a silent prayer, and walked onto the Ryman stage. The stage lights were warmer than George expected, washing over him like a physical presence as he stepped up to the microphone. Behind him, he could hear the band settling into position. Daniel adjusting his guitar strap, Rebecca rosining her bow, Vincent checking his steel guitar tuning one final time, Anthony's bass producing a low, grounding hum. The audience was a sea of faces stretching back into the shadows. 2,150 people who'd paid money to see if traditional country music still had something to say. George gripped the microphone stand, his palms slightly damp despite years of performing. "Good evening, Nashville," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the legendary acoustics of the Ryman. "Thank you all for being here tonight. We've got some stories to tell you, some songs that we believe in, and we hope you'll come along for the ride." A wave of applause and supportive whistles filled the room. George could see faces in the front rows. Frank Sullivan was there, along with several other industry veterans whose presence both encouraged and intimidated him. But mostly, he saw regular people, country music fans, who'd taken a chance on something different. He counted off "Unwound" with a nod to Daniel, and the band kicked in with a confidence that belied their nerves. George's voice found its groove immediately, that distinctive clear tenor that had first caught MCA's attention years ago. But tonight, it sounded different, more lived in, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The crowd responded positively, heads nodding, some people clapping along. It was a strong start, familiar territory that established credibility. When they finished, the applause was genuine and energetic. "That's a song about losing something you didn't know you had until it was gone," George said between songs, which seems to be a theme in country music, or life in general, really. Light laughter from the audience. They were warming up, becoming comfortable. Good. This next song is brand new. It's called "Amarillo by Morning," and it's about a rodeo cowboy who's lost everything except his determination to keep going. The opening notes of steel guitar wept through the Ryman, and George began to sing. This was one of his favorite songs, a story of resilience and stubborn hope that resonated with anyone who'd ever fought for something despite the odds. Vincent's steel guitar work was transcendent, adding layers of emotion that elevated the already powerful lyrics. George looked out at the audience and saw people swaying, couples holding hands, older folks with tears in their eyes, remembering their own struggles and triumphs. This was why he'd fought so hard, for these moments of connection, when a song stopped being just notes and words and became something shared, something that reminded people they weren't alone. The applause when they finished was louder, more enthusiastic. He could feel the energy in the room shifting, the audience leaning in rather than holding back. They moved through the set list with growing confidence. Each song built on the previous one, creating a narrative arc about loss and hope, struggle and perseverance, the small victories that made life worth living. Jennifer's newer songs fit seamlessly with George's established material, proving that traditional country wasn't stuck in the past. It was just telling timeless stories with honesty. About 40 minutes into the set, George introduced "Small Town Saturday Night," one of Jennifer's songs that had become a favorite during rehearsals. "This next one was written by Jennifer Hayes," he said, gesturing to where she stood in the wings. "It's about a place where nothing ever happens and everything matters. For anyone who grew up in a town small enough that the Friday night football game was the biggest event of the week, this one's for you." The song painted a vivid picture of teenage life in rural America, driving back roads, hanging out in parking lots, dreaming of escape, while secretly hoping things never changed. Rebecca's fiddle danced through the verses, playful and nostalgic, while Anthony's bass kept a steady heartbeat underneath. George watched the audience and saw recognition on faces. These were their stories, their memories. In the front row, a woman about his age mouthed along with the words, tears streaming down her face. A couple in their 60s held each other, lost in their own memories of Saturday nights 50 years ago. This was the power of authentic storytelling. It transcended age and specific circumstance to touch something universal. The labels had forgotten this in their chase for crossover appeal and demographic targeting. They'd forgotten that the best way to appeal to everyone was to speak honestly to someone. When the song ended, the applause was thunderous. George saw Frank Sullivan stand up, clapping hard, and others in the industry section followed suit. This was working. It was actually working. "Thank you," George said, genuinely moved. "That means a lot." To Jennifer, too. She's backstage, probably biting her nails down to nubs. Laughter from the crowd, and George saw Jennifer in the wings, hand over her mouth, crying with relief and joy. They took a brief intermission after the 8th song, giving everyone a chance to breathe and regroup. Backstage, the mood was electric. "Did you hear them?" Rebecca said, practically bouncing with excitement. "They're really listening, really responding." "We're halfway there," Daniel cautioned, though his eyes were bright. "Can't let up now." George found a quiet corner and closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself. The first half had gone better than he'd dared hope, but the second half would be crucial. They'd proven they could perform well, but now they needed to prove they could sustain it, build to something meaningful. Patricia appeared with water bottles. "You're doing great out there. The energy is incredible. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." When they returned to the stage, the audience welcomed them back enthusiastically. George could feel that they'd won the crowd over, that these people were now invested in the journey. "We're going to slow things down a bit," George said, settling onto a stool that had been placed center stage. "This next song is called The Last Dance, and it's about those moments when you know something precious is ending, but you want to hold on to it just a little bit longer." The band created a spare, delicate soundscape. Just Daniel's acoustic guitar and Vincent's subtle steel guitar embellishments. George's voice carried the melody without embellishment, letting the raw emotion of Jennifer's lyrics shine through. The song told the story of a couple's final evening together before circumstances pulled them apart. Not through conflict or falling out of love, but through the inevitable pressures of life. Work opportunities in different cities, family obligations, dreams that couldn't coexist. It was heartbreaking precisely because it was so ordinary, so recognizable. George could have heard a pin drop in the Ryman. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word, every note. When he reached the final verse, about driving away while watching headlights fade in the rearview mirror, his own voice caught slightly, with genuine emotion. The last note faded into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the applause began, starting slowly and building into something overwhelming. People stood, wiping their eyes, some sobbing openly. George saw grown men removing their cowboy hats and wiping their faces, couples embracing each other tightly. This was the moment George would remember for the rest of his life. Not the applause itself, but the recognition that music could still do this, could still break hearts open and remind people of their own humanity. "Thank you," he said quietly, when the applause finally subsided. "Thank you for feeling that with us." The rest of the second half built naturally from that emotional peak. They picked up the tempo with some honky-tonk numbers that got people clapping and tapping their feet, providing relief from the intensity, while maintaining the authentic spirit. Vincent took an extended steel guitar solo on San Antonio Stroll that showcased his virtuosity, earning cheers and whistles. Rebecca stepped forward for a fiddle showcase on a traditional tune, her fingers flying across the strings with breathtaking precision. The audience responded with the kind of appreciation that showed they recognized real talent when they heard it. As they approached the final songs, George felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. They'd done it, delivered a performance that proved traditional country could still move people, still fill rooms, still matter. But he also knew that when this ended, reality would intrude. Would anyone offer him a record deal? Would the industry people who'd witnessed this performance take a chance on his vision? For the penultimate song, they performed Fool-Hearted Memory, a ballad that George had recorded before but never felt he'd fully captured. Tonight, with this band and this audience, everything clicked. His vocal was vulnerable and strong simultaneously. The band provided perfect support without overwhelming, and the emotional truth of the lyrics landed with devastating clarity. Then it was time for the closer. George had debated long and hard about what song should end the show. Something up-tempo? A crowd-pleasing standard? Another new song from Jennifer? In the end, he'd chosen Ace in the Hole, an upbeat number that celebrated the resilience and optimism that defined country music at its best. It was about having faith that things would work out, that the next hand dealt might be the winning one, that determination and hope could see you through the darkest times. The band kicked into high gear, and George felt all the tension and worry of the past months lift away. Whatever happened next, they'd made something good tonight. Something real and honest and powerful. The audience was clapping along, singing the chorus, caught up in the joyful energy. As they hit the final chord, George's arms were raised, the audience on their feet, the band grinning at each other with the satisfaction of a job well done. The applause was deafening, sustained, filled with genuine appreciation rather than polite obligation. "Thank you, Nashville," George shouted over the noise. "Thank you for reminding us why we do this. Thank you for believing in real country music." They took their bows, first as a band, then George bringing each member forward individually for recognition. When he introduced Jennifer from the wings, the applause was especially warm, and she ran out with tears streaming down her face to embrace him. The encore was inevitable. The crowd wasn't going to let them leave without one more song. They performed Unwound again, this time with the audience singing along on the chorus, turning it into a communal celebration rather than just a performance. Finally, reluctantly, it ended. George and the band left the stage to sustained applause that followed them into the wings. Backstage, they collapsed into chairs and each other's arms, exhausted and exhilarated. "We did it," Daniel said, his voice hoarse from singing backup harmonies all night. "We actually did it." That was... Rebecca couldn't finish the sentence, overcome with emotion. Patricia appeared with more water and towels. "That was one of the best shows I've seen in this building in 20 years. The audience loved it. More importantly, you could tell you meant every word. That's rare." Within minutes, visitors started arriving backstage. Fans who'd somehow made their way past security, wanting autographs and photos. Local media requesting quick interviews. And then the industry people. Frank Sullivan was first, his eyes bright with satisfaction. "George, that was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. You proved your point. Traditional country isn't dead. It was just waiting for someone with the courage to do it right." "Does that mean someone might be interested in signing me?" George asked, only half joking. "Let's talk tomorrow," Frank said with a meaningful look. "I have some ideas." Other producers and label representatives filtered through, offering congratulations and vague promises to stay in touch. George had been in the business long enough to know that most of these would lead nowhere, but even the possibility felt like validation. The owner of a small independent label based in Texas, William Rodriguez, pulled George aside. "That was special, son. I don't have the resources of a major label, but if you're interested in a partnership where you maintain creative control, I'd like to discuss possibilities. Traditional country might not be what Nashville wants right now, but there's a whole country out there that's hungry for it." George took his card, genuinely intrigued. An independent label wouldn't provide the promotional machine of MCA, but it might offer something more valuable: freedom to make the music he believed in. The backstage crowd eventually thinned, leaving just the band and a few close friends. They sat in the green room, too wired to leave, processing what had just happened. "So, what now?" Anthony asked. "We just proved traditional country can work. Where does that leave us?" "Honestly, I don't know," George admitted. "But I know this. Whatever happens next, we did something important tonight. We reminded people, and ourselves, what country music can be when it's honest and authentic. That counts for something." "It counts for everything," Jennifer said. She'd been approached by 3 different publishers during the backstage meet and greet, all suddenly interested in her catalog. "A week ago, I couldn't get anyone to return my calls. Tonight, I've got meetings lined up for the next month. This changed things, George. For all of us." They stayed at the Ryman until nearly midnight, unwilling to let the evening end. Eventually, though, reality intruded. They had to pack up equipment, settle accounts with the venue, return to their regular lives and see what opportunities might emerge from tonight's success. As George drove back to his hotel, his phone rang. It was Norma. "How did it go?" she asked, though the answer was evident in his voice. "It was perfect," George said. "Better than I could have hoped. The crowd responded. The industry people noticed. And we proved that traditional country can still move people. I don't know what happens next, but at least I know we didn't compromise." "I'm proud of you," Norma said simply. "The kids and I watched the late news, and they had footage of you performing." Jennifer kept saying, "That's my dad." She was so excited. George felt emotion well up again. "I wish you could have been there." "I was there in spirit," Norma said. "And George, whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Like always." After they hung up, George sat in his truck in the hotel parking lot, not quite ready to go inside. He looked at the lights of Nashville spread out before him. This city that had been the site of so much struggle, and now, potentially, redemption. His phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "You have 3 meetings Monday, 2 independent labels and 1 major. Also, radio calls are coming in. This is happening." George allowed himself a small smile. They weren't out of the woods yet. There were still details to negotiate, financial realities to face, decisions to make about the future. But tonight had proven something essential. There was still room in country music for authenticity, for stories honestly told, for tradition honored rather than abandoned. He finally went up to his room, exhausted but unable to sleep. He lay in bed replaying moments from the performance, remembering the audience's faces, the way Jennifer's songs had landed, the tight musicianship of the band, the feeling of standing on that historic stage and knowing he was doing exactly what he was meant to do. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, just for tonight, he'd won. The morning after the Ryman show, George woke to his phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand. Bleary-eyed, he checked the time, 6:47 a.m. After only 5 hours of sleep, his body was staging a protest, but his mind was already racing. The first call was from Robert, his voice unusually animated. "George, turn on the radio. Any country station. You're all anyone's talking about." George fumbled for the remote to the hotel room's radio and found WSIX, one of Nashville's biggest country stations. The morning show hosts were in mid-conversation about the previous night's performance. "And I'm telling you, Linda, I was skeptical," the male host was saying. "Another artist claiming traditional country is making a comeback. But I was at the Ryman last night, and George Strait made a believer out of me. That was the real deal." "I heard the recordings," Linda replied. The audience response was incredible, and apparently several major industry figures were in attendance. This could change things. George listened in disbelief as they played a bootleg recording of "The Last Dance" from the previous night. The audio quality was rough, recorded on someone's handheld device, but the emotional power still came through. "This is what country music should sound like," the male host said after the song ended. "Not overproduced pop with a fiddle thrown in for flavor. Real stories, real emotions, real musicianship. Nashville needs to pay attention." Robert was still on the other line. "You hearing this?" "Yeah," George said, still processing. "Is this really happening?" "It's really happening. I've got 6 more calls to make this morning, but I wanted you to hear it firsthand. Your Monday meetings just got a lot more interesting. These labels aren't doing you a favor anymore. You've got leverage." After Robert hung up, George showered and dressed, his exhaustion fighting with adrenaline. He was supposed to meet the band for breakfast at 9, and he had a feeling it was going to be an interesting conversation. The restaurant was a diner 2 blocks from the hotel, the kind of place that served strong coffee and substantial portions. George arrived to find everyone already there, huddled around a table with newspapers spread out. "You made the Tennessean," Daniel said, sliding the entertainment section across to George. The headline read, "George Strait's Ryman performance proves traditional country isn't dead." Below it was a photo of George mid-performance, microphone in hand, the intensity of the moment captured perfectly. The review was glowing. In an industry increasingly dominated by pop-country crossover attempts, George Strait offered a masterclass in authentic country music storytelling. His Ryman Auditorium performance showcased not just his considerable vocal talent, but also the enduring power of well-crafted songs that speak to real human experiences. With a crack band and material that honored country music's traditions, while feeling entirely contemporary, Strait reminded Nashville why it became Music City in the first place. This wasn't nostalgia. It was country music's future, if the industry is brave enough to embrace it. "That's amazing," George said, though part of him felt disconnected from the praise, as if it were describing someone else's achievement. Jennifer was practically glowing. "I've had 4 publishers call me this morning. 4! They all want to meet early next week. One of them actually apologized for passing on my demos 6 months ago." "Funny how a little success changes people's minds," Vincent said dryly. "I got 3 calls too. Session work, but on projects that actually sound interesting for once." The waitress arrived to take orders, and George was grateful for the momentary interruption. As much as the positive response was validating, it also felt overwhelming. They'd set out to prove a point, and apparently, they'd succeeded beyond expectations. But success brought its own complications. After they ordered, Anthony leaned forward. "So, what's the plan, George? You've got meetings Monday. What are you looking for in a deal?" "Honestly, I'm not sure yet," George admitted. "Last week, I would have been grateful for any deal that let me keep making music. Now, I'm in a position to be selective, which is surreal. I need to figure out what I really want." "Creative control should be non-negotiable," Rebecca said firmly. "That's what this whole thing was about, right? Not compromising your vision to fit someone else's idea of what sells." But creative control without distribution doesn't do much good, Daniel countered. You need a partner who can get your music out there, promote it properly. Otherwise, you're just making great records nobody hears. There's got to be a middle ground, Jennifer said. Someone who respects what you're doing, but has the resources to support it. They talked through various scenarios over breakfast, weighing options and possibilities. By the time they finished, George had a clearer sense of his priorities. Maintain artistic integrity, find a partner who understood traditional country, ensure the band could continue working together, and secure Jennifer's involvement as a primary songwriter. The rest of Saturday passed in a blur of phone calls and informal meetings. Word of the Ryman Show had spread quickly, and suddenly people who'd been dismissive or indifferent were very interested in George Strait's future plans. Late in the afternoon, George met with Frank Sullivan at a quiet bar away from Music Row's bustle. Frank ordered bourbon, and George stuck with coffee, his nerves already jangling from too much caffeine and too little sleep. "Let me get straight to the point," Frank said after they settled into a corner booth. "I want to produce your next album. Not for a major label. They'll just try to change you like MCA did. But I have relationships with several independent labels that would give you the freedom you need while providing decent distribution." "Why?" George asked. "You're retired. You don't need this." Frank smiled. "Because last night reminded me why I got into this business 40 years ago. Not to make hits or maximize quarterly profits, but to help artists make meaningful music. You've got something special, George. That performance was the most authentic country music I've heard in years. I'd like to be part of what comes next." "What kind of deal are we talking about?" "I'd work for a reduced fee, plus points on the album," Frank said. "We'd need to find a label willing to commit without demanding creative control. It's possible. There are people out there who still believe in artist-driven projects. We'd have a smaller budget than a major label album, which means we work lean and smart, but we'd have freedom." George considered this. Frank Sullivan's name still carried weight in Nashville. His involvement would lend credibility and attract better musicians, better studios, better opportunities. But it would also mean committing to a path that diverged from the traditional major label route. "Let me think about it," George said. "I've got meetings Monday that might change the equation." "Fair enough," Frank said. "But George, I'll tell you something. Major labels will offer you money and promotion, but they'll also want to shape you into something more commercially viable. Some artists can handle that balance. Based on what I saw last night and everything I know about you, I don't think you can. I think you need to be true to your vision. Consequences be damned." That evening, George called Norma. She'd been fielding calls at home, too. Friends and neighbors who'd heard about the show, distant relatives suddenly wanting to reconnect, even a reporter from the San Marcos newspaper requesting an interview. "It's crazy here," Norma said. "Everyone wants a piece of what happened last night. How are you holding up?" "Honestly, I feel like I'm in someone else's life," George admitted. "A week ago, I was facing the end of my career. Now, I've got multiple labels interested, and Frank Sullivan wants to produce my next album. It's surreal." "What does your gut tell you?" Norma asked. She'd always been good at cutting through confusion to the essential question. "That I should work with Frank and an independent label," George said. "It feels right. But it's also the riskier path. Less money up front, smaller promotional budget, no guarantee of radio play on major stations." "But you'd be making the music you believe in," Norma said. "That was the whole point of the Ryman Show, wasn't it? Proving that traditional country could work on its own terms? If you sign with a major label now and let them shape you, doesn't that undermine everything you just accomplished?" As usual, she was right. George knew what he needed to do, even if it scared him. Sunday was quieter, deliberately so. George spent the morning at the hotel, reviewing notes and preparing for Monday's meetings. The band had scattered. Daniel back to Nashville apartment hunting, Rebecca visiting family in Kentucky, Anthony and Vincent handling personal business. They'd all agreed to reconvene Monday evening to hear how the meetings went. In the afternoon, George drove out to the countryside beyond Nashville, needing space and perspective. He found himself on back roads, winding through green hills, past farms and small towns that looked like they hadn't changed in 50 years. This was the America his music spoke to and for, not the coastal cities or even Nashville's industry bubble, but the heartland where people still valued authenticity and tradition. He stopped at a roadside diner for lunch and found himself recognized by the waitress, a woman in her 40s named Catherine Barnes, who'd been at the Ryman show. "You're George Strait," she said, smiling. "I was there Friday night with my husband. That show meant something to us. We grew up on real country music, and lately, we'd been feeling like it didn't exist anymore. You reminded us it does." "That's really kind of you to say," George said, touched by her sincerity. "I mean it," Catherine continued. "My husband works construction. I work here and at a grocery store on weekends. We're not fancy people. But your music speaks to our lives. The struggles, the small joys, the way love isn't always perfect, but it's real. Don't let Nashville change that. We need music that understands us." After she walked away, George sat with her words. This was why he'd fought so hard, not for industry validation or commercial success, but for people like Catherine and her husband who needed to hear their stories reflected in music. Whatever deal he made, that had to remain the priority. Monday morning arrived with thunderstorms, rain lashing against the hotel windows, and thunder rumbling in the distance. George wore his best Western suit to the meetings, wanting to look professional while maintaining his Texas identity. The first meeting was with William Rodriguez at the independent Texas label. His office was modest but warm, filled with photographs of country music legends and gold records from artists George respected. William was a heavy-set man in his 50s with an easy manner and shrewd eyes. "George, I'm going to be straight with you," William said after they settled in. "I can't compete with major labels on money. My promotional budget is a fraction of what MCA could offer. But here's what I can give you: complete creative control, a team that actually understands traditional country, and distribution in markets that still care about real music. Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, parts of the Midwest. We're regional, but we're strong where we operate." "What kind of sales numbers are we talking about?" George asked. "Our biggest artists move 50,000 to 75,000 copies per album," William said honestly. "That's not platinum, not even gold by major label standards, but it's profitable and it's sustainable. Our artists make a living making the music they want to make. That's worth something." The meeting lasted 2 hours, and George left impressed by William's honesty and vision, even if the financial realities were sobering. The second meeting was with an A&R representative from Columbia Records, one of the major labels that had been watching the Ryman performance's aftermath. His name was Douglas Wright, and he had the polished confidence of someone accustomed to signing successful artists. "George, we see huge potential," Douglas said in a conference room that screamed corporate money. "The Ryman show proved you can connect with audiences. Now let's talk about how we take that to the next level. We're thinking crossover appeal. Keep the traditional country foundation, but add production elements that can get you on pop radio. Maybe some collaborations with contemporary artists. We've mapped out a whole campaign." "What about creative control?" George asked. "You'd have input, of course," Douglas said smoothly. "But our team has decades of experience knowing what works commercially. We'd be collaborative partners." George recognized the code words. Collaborative partners, meant they'd make suggestions he'd be pressured to accept. Input meant they'd listen to his ideas before overruling them. This was exactly what he'd been fighting against. The meeting ended cordially, but without commitment. As George left the Columbia building, he knew that wasn't the path forward, regardless of the money involved. The final meeting was with Frank Sullivan, and the owner of a small independent label called Americana Records, based in Memphis. James Peterson was younger than George expected, maybe 40, with the casual dress and genuine passion of someone who'd started his label because he loved music, not because he wanted to get rich. "Here's my pitch," James said over coffee at a neutral location. "We're small, we're scrappy, and we don't have delusions about making you a pop star. But we've got great relationships with Americana and roots music radio programmers, solid distribution in key markets, and a track record of artist-friendly deals. Frank would produce, you'd have full creative control, and we'd market you as exactly what you are, an authentic, traditional country artist for people who miss when country music had soul." "What's the financial structure?" George asked. James laid out numbers that were modest but fair. A reasonable advance, equitable royalty splits, and complete transparency on expenses. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was sustainable. And more importantly, it came with no strings attached to his artistic vision. "I want to be honest with you," James said. "You're not going to get rich off this deal, at least not quickly. But you'll make music you're proud of, build a loyal fan base, and have the freedom to grow organically. We play the long game." After the meeting, George walked through downtown Memphis in the rain, processing everything. 3 distinct paths: regional success with William, major label compromise with Columbia, or independent artistic freedom with James and Frank. The choice felt simultaneously obvious and terrifying. That evening, he gathered the band at a restaurant in Nashville to share his thoughts. They listened attentively as he recounted each meeting. "So, what are you leaning toward?" Daniel asked. "Americana Records, with Frank producing," George said. "It's the path that honors what we did at the Ryman. It's consistent with everything we've said about artistic integrity. But I need you all to understand what it means. Smaller budgets, less promotion, no guarantee of mainstream success. We'd be building something ground up." "I'm in," Rebecca said immediately. "I didn't play the Ryman to go back to soulless session work." "Same," Vincent agreed. "I've been chasing a paycheck my whole career. Time to chase something that matters." Anthony and Daniel nodded their agreement. Jennifer, who'd been invited to join them, was crying quietly. "Does this mean what I think it means?" she asked. "If you're willing, I want you as primary songwriter for the album," George said. "Your voice, your stories, that's what made the Ryman show special. This needs to be a collaboration." "Yes," Jennifer said through tears. 1,000 times yes." George called James Peterson the next morning and accepted the Americana Records deal. By the end of the week, contracts were drafted and lawyers were reviewing terms. Frank Sullivan was already talking about studio time and recording approaches. MCA sent a formal termination letter 2 weeks later. Professional, but cold. George read it without emotion. That chapter was closed, and he was okay with it. The album would be recorded in July at a small studio in Austin, with Frank producing and the core band from the Ryman Show, plus additional musicians as needed. The budget was tight, but workable. The timeline was ambitious, but achievable. And most importantly, George would make the album he'd always wanted to make, without compromise or outside pressure. As spring turned to summer, the impact of the Ryman Show continued to ripple through the country music world. Other artists began talking more openly about their frustrations with industry pressure to chase pop trends. A few established stars started incorporating more traditional elements into their music. Radio programmers in smaller markets began creating real country programming blocks. It wasn't a revolution, exactly, but it was a shift. George's stand had given permission to others to question the prevailing narrative about what country music needed to be. On a warm June evening, George sat on his porch in San Marcos, guitar in hand, working through a new song Jennifer had sent. Norma brought out 2 glasses of lemonade and settled into the chair beside him. "Penny for your thoughts," she said. "Just thinking about how much has changed since February," George said. "I thought my career was over. Instead, I'm about to record an album exactly the way I want, with people I trust, for a label that believes in what we're doing. It's not what I expected, but it's better." "That's because you didn't compromise," Norma said. "You believed in something and fought for it, even when everyone said you were wrong. That matters, George, not just for your career, but for what it says about who you are." "I couldn't have done it without you," George said honestly. "Or the band, or Jennifer, or everyone who believed when they had no reason to." "That's the thing about real community," Norma said. "When you're fighting for something that matters, you're never fighting alone." The following week, George drove to Austin for pre-production meetings with Frank. They spent 3 days going through songs, discussing arrangements, planning the recording approach. Frank's experience and George's vision meshed perfectly. The older producer understood how to capture authenticity without sacrificing quality, how to honor tradition without sounding dated. "This is going to be special," Frank said as they wrapped up. "I can feel it. You've got 13 songs that tell a coherent story about American life. The struggles, the small victories, the way love sustains us through hard times. That's an album, not just a collection of singles." Recording began in mid-July and immediately felt different from George's MCA sessions. There was no pressure to chase radio formats or demographic appeal. They simply focused on serving the songs, capturing honest performances, letting the material breathe and reveal itself naturally. Vincent Palmer's steel guitar work was transcendent, adding emotional depth without overwhelming. Rebecca Turner's fiddle danced through arrangements with both precision and spontaneity. Anthony Richards's bass provided solid foundations that freed everyone else to take chances. And Daniel Crawford's guitar work tied everything together with clean, purposeful licks that honored tradition while adding subtle contemporary touches. Jennifer was in the studio for most of the recording, sometimes suggesting lyrical tweaks or offering insights into what she'd intended with particular songs. Her presence kept everyone focused on the stories they were telling, the emotional truth they were trying to capture. They recorded live in the studio as much as possible, capturing the energy of musicians playing together in real time rather than building tracks piece by piece. It gave the album a cohesive, organic feel that perfectly matched the material. One particular session stood out. They were recording "Highways and Heartaches," Jennifer's song about a truck driver torn between the road and home. George had sung it dozens of times in rehearsal, but this time, something clicked. He thought about all the sacrifices he'd made for music, all the time away from family, all the struggles to stay true to himself. When he sang the final verse about choosing to go home, about recognizing that success without family means nothing, his voice cracked with genuine emotion. Frank signaled to keep rolling. George finished the take with tears in his eyes, the band providing the perfect understated support. When the song ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. "That's the one," Frank finally said. "We're done with this song." By the end of August, they'd recorded 15 songs and selected 13 for the album. Mixing and mastering took another month, with Frank obsessing over every detail while somehow maintaining the raw, immediate feel of the performances. The album, titled Strait Country, was scheduled for release in early January. Time to capitalize on post-holiday buying while avoiding the crowded fall release schedule. The cover photo showed George in his cowboy hat, sitting on a fence rail with Texas hills stretching behind him. Simple, direct, authentic. Americana Records planned a modest promotional campaign focused on Americana radio, independent country stations, and grassroots marketing. They didn't have budget for television commercials or major magazine spreads, but they had a good story and music they believed in. In November, they released Amarillo by Morning as the lead single. Response was immediate and strong, not on mainstream country radio, which still favored pop country crossover, but on alternative formats and in markets that valued traditional sound. The song climbed Americana charts and began generating requests on traditional country stations. More importantly, it connected with listeners. Letters poured into radio stations praising the song's authenticity. Fan clubs began forming spontaneously. George started getting invited to perform at festivals and venues that celebrated roots music. "We're building something sustainable," James Peterson told George during a check-in call. "Not a flash-in-the-pan hit, but a genuine fan base. These are listeners who will buy every album, come to every show, tell their friends." That's how careers are built. As the year drew to a close, George reflected on everything that had happened since that February meeting at MCA Records. He'd lost a major label deal, but gained artistic freedom. He'd risked financial security, but found a path forward that honored his values. He'd faced the possibility of career failure, but instead discovered a community of fellow artists who shared his vision. On Christmas Eve, the whole band gathered at George's house for dinner. It had become a tradition, this makeshift family of musicians who'd come together around shared beliefs and had somehow built something lasting. "I want to propose a toast," George said, raising his glass, "to taking chances, to staying true. To everyone around this table who believed when belief didn't make sense. Whatever happens with the album, whatever comes next in our careers, I'm grateful we took this journey together. To not compromising," Daniel added. "To real country music," Rebecca said. "To second chances," Jennifer contributed, thinking of how close she'd come to giving up on her dreams. "To family, whatever form it takes," Norma said, looking around at the faces gathered in her home. They clinked glasses, and George felt a profound sense of peace. The album would succeed or fail on its own merits. Critics would praise or dismiss it. Sales would meet expectations or fall short. But none of that could diminish what they'd accomplished. A stand for authenticity in an industry increasingly disconnected from its roots. Strait Country released on January 15th to reviews that ranged from enthusiastic to ecstatic. The Chicago Tribune called it a masterclass in traditional country music for the modern era. Rolling Stone, not typically friendly to mainstream country, praised it as proof that Nashville hasn't completely lost its soul. Even the skeptical Billboard magazine admitted it was undeniably authentic, executed with precision and heart. Sales started modest but steady, building week by week through word of mouth and radio play on non-mainstream stations. By March, they'd moved 45,000 copies, not platinum, but profitable and sustainable. More importantly, it established George Strait as an artist with a clear identity and dedicated fan base. Tour offers came in, and George put together a modest circuit of clubs and small theaters where he could replicate the intimate atmosphere of the Ryman show. The venues weren't glamorous, but they were filled with people who genuinely cared about the music. At a show in Austin in late March, George looked out at the crowd. Not the biggest audience he'd ever played for, but perhaps the most engaged. They knew every word, hung on every note, responded to every story between songs. This was what success looked like when measured not by Billboard rankings, but by genuine connection. Backstage after that show, Jennifer found him. She'd signed a publishing deal based on the album's success and was now writing for several artists, her distinctive voice finally finding appreciation. "I've been thinking about that night at Tootsie's," she said. "When you offered to listen to my songs, even though you were facing the biggest decision of your career. You didn't have to do that. You could have just focused on your own problems." "Helping you helped me," George said. "It reminded me what I was fighting for. Not just my career, but the whole ecosystem of people trying to make authentic music." "Well, I want you to know it mattered," Jennifer said. "You changed my life. You probably changed a lot of lives." As spring progressed, the industry began to take notice. Traditional country, while still not dominating the charts, was carving out a viable niche. Several young artists cited George's Ryman show as inspiration for their own artistic directions. Conversations about authenticity versus commercialism became more common in Nashville circles. It wasn't the revolution George had secretly hoped for, but it was progress. He'd proven that an artist could succeed on their own terms, that there was room in country music for tradition alongside contemporary trends, that audiences still hungered for authentic storytelling. In May, exactly 1 year after the Ryman performance, George received a call from the venue. They wanted him to return for an anniversary show, this time with full booking and promotional support. What had started as a risky independent showcase was now being recognized as a significant moment in country music history. "Full circle," Robert said when George told him. "From ultimatum to industry validation in 12 months. Not bad." But George knew it wasn't really about industry validation. It was about finding his voice and having the courage to use it. About building community with fellow artists who shared his values. About making music that mattered to real people living real lives. The second Ryman show, held on May 10th, sold out in 3 days. This time, major industry figures weren't just observers, but participants, acknowledging that George Strait had been right about something important. Traditional country had a place, an audience, a future. Standing backstage before that show, George thought about everything that had led to this moment. The ultimatum from MCA, the chance meeting with Daniel at Tootsie's, Jennifer's determination, the band's willingness to risk everything, Norma's unwavering support, Frank Sullivan's guidance, the 2,150 people who'd taken a chance on the first show. All those moments, all those decisions had brought him here, not to fame or fortune in the traditional sense, but to something more valuable, the freedom to make music he believed in, surrounded by people he respected, for an audience that appreciated authenticity. "Ready?" Daniel asked, appearing at his shoulder. George nodded, settling his hat on his head. "Let's go remind them why we do this." They walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, and George felt the familiar rush of performing at the Ryman. That sense of stepping into history while making it at the same time. The audience was even more diverse than the first show. Longtime country fans, younger people discovering traditional music for the first time, industry professionals who'd come to witness what they'd missed before, journalists documenting a cultural moment. George stepped up to the microphone, the lights warming his face, and smiled. "We were here a year ago tonight, trying to prove something, trying to show that traditional country music still mattered, still had power, still deserved a place in the conversation. Thank you all for proving we were right." The crowd erupted. George counted off unwound, and they launched into a set that mixed songs from straight country with newer material he'd been working on. The band was even tighter than before. Their chemistry deepened by a year of working together. Jennifer joined them on stage for several songs, her confidence transformed from the nervous songwriter who'd been rejected at Tootsie's to an established writer with her own success story. Midway through the show, George brought out a surprise guest, Frank Sullivan, who'd rarely performed in recent years. Frank played piano on The Last Dance, adding delicate touches that elevated the already emotional song. When it ended, the standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes. "Frank Sullivan, ladies and gentlemen," George said, his voice thick with gratitude. "A man who believed in this music when others didn't, who helped us make an album we're proud of. There aren't enough thank yous in the world." As the show progressed, George realized something profound. He wasn't just performing anymore. He was part of a movement, small but growing, of artists refusing to compromise their vision for commercial expediency. Other performers in the audience, he could see them from the stage, were watching intently, perhaps finding courage for their own stands. During the encore, George addressed the audience one final time. "A year ago, I stood on this stage, not knowing if I'd have a career the next day. I want to thank everyone who took a chance, who bought a ticket, bought an album, told a friend, requested a song on the radio. You proved that there's still an audience for music that tells true stories, that honors tradition while staying relevant. This isn't just my success. It's ours, all of us who believe that country music means something." The final notes of "Ace in the Hole" rang out through the Ryman, and George raised his arms in triumph. Not because he'd conquered Nashville or topped the charts, but because he'd stayed true to himself and found that was enough. Backstage afterward, the atmosphere was celebratory, but also reflective. They'd accomplished something significant, yes, but they also knew the work wasn't finished. Every album would be a new challenge, every show an opportunity to prove themselves again. Norma had driven up from San Marcos with the kids for this show, and George found her in the green room, Jennifer and George Jr. excitedly recounting their favorite moments. "Dad, that was so cool," George Jr. said. "Everyone was singing along." "They love your music," Jennifer added with the simple conviction of a 10-year-old. George hugged them both, then pulled Norma close. "Thank you for believing when I didn't." "I always believed," she said. "I just needed you to believe in yourself." Later that night, after the kids had fallen asleep in the hotel and Norma was reading beside him, George's phone rang. It was William Rodriguez, the Texas label owner he'd met with a year ago. "George, I wanted to congratulate you on tonight's show and on everything you've accomplished this year," William said. "I also wanted to let you know that what you did, proving traditional country could work on its own terms, it opened doors for a lot of artists. I've signed 3 new acts in the past 6 months, all because you showed there was a market for authentic music. You changed things." After hanging up, George lay in the darkness thinking about legacies. His father had worked construction his whole life, building structures that would outlast him. George was building something different, not physical, but perhaps more enduring. Music that spoke truth, that honored tradition, that reminded people of their own humanity. The album continued selling steadily through the summer, eventually crossing 100,000 copies, gold by independent label standards, even if major labels wouldn't recognize it. More importantly, it established a template. Artists could succeed outside the mainstream by building dedicated fan bases rather than chasing fleeting trends. In August, George started writing songs for a second album, working again with Jennifer. The process was easier this time, without the pressure of proving anything. They could simply focus on telling good stories, crafting honest songs, trusting that the audience they'd built would respond. "What's this one about?" Jennifer asked as George played her a new melody. "It's about a farmer deciding whether to sell his land to developers," George said. "The money would solve all his problems, but the land has been in his family for 4 generations. It's about what we choose to keep and what we're willing to let go." Jennifer nodded, already hearing lyrics in her head. "That's good. That's real." People understand that choice, not necessarily about land, but about identity, about whether to hold on to who you are or become someone else for practical reasons. They worked through the afternoon, lyrics and melody coming together naturally. This was the creative freedom George had fought for, the ability to write about what mattered without worrying about radio formats or demographic appeal. As autumn arrived, George took stock of where he was. He'd never topped the Billboard Hot 100. He'd never won a major industry award. His videos didn't play on MTV. By conventional measures, he wasn't a superstar, but he had something more valuable: artistic integrity, a loyal fan base, respect from peers, and the knowledge that his music mattered to real people. He could look at himself in the mirror without compromise or regret. One evening in late September, George was teaching Jennifer to play guitar on the back porch when she asked, "Dad, are you famous?" George considered the question. Maybe to some people, but that's not really the point. "What is the point?" she asked, with characteristic 10-year-old directness. "Making music that's true," George said. "Telling stories that matter. Being someone your family can be proud of. Fame is just what might happen along the way, but it's not the goal." "I'm proud of you," Jennifer said simply, returning her focus to the chord she was learning. George felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was success. Not gold records or sold-out arenas, but his daughter's pride, his son's excitement, his wife's partnership, his friends' respect. Everything else was bonus. The second album, Honky Tonk Heroes, was released the following January to even stronger reviews than the first. Sales were better, radio play expanded to more stations, and George's touring schedule grew busier. He was building a career on his own terms, slowly but sustainably. By the third year, George Strait had become something of an icon in the traditional country community, not the biggest star, but one of the most respected. Young artists sought his advice. Established performers praised his integrity. And most importantly, fans continued showing up. Album after album, show after show. The industry eventually came around, at least partially. Major labels began signing a few traditional country acts, though they remained primarily focused on pop country crossover. But there was now acknowledged space for artists who wanted to honor country music's roots. And George had helped create that space. Standing on stage at the Grand Ole Opry 5 years after the original Ryman show, now a regular performer at country music's most sacred venue, George looked out at the audience and thought about the journey. From an ultimatum that could have ended his career to building something lasting and meaningful. This song is for everyone who's ever been told to change who they are to fit someone else's expectations, George said before launching into Amarillo by Morning. For everyone who chose authenticity over approval. For everyone who believed in something when believing didn't make sense. The audience responded with the kind of deep connection that only comes from shared values. They weren't just fans. They were fellow believers in the idea that music should mean something, that tradition deserved respect, that authenticity mattered more than commercial success. As George sang, his voice strong and clear, the band providing perfect support, he realized this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not in spite of the struggles and sacrifices, but because of them. The difficult path had led to the right destination. After the show, Daniel found him backstage. "You know what's crazy? 5 years ago, we were a bunch of musicians taking a desperate chance at the Ryman. Now we've made 4 albums together, toured hundreds of shows, and inspired a whole generation of artists to stay traditional. That's a legacy, George." "It's our legacy," George corrected. "None of this happens without everyone who believed. You, Rebecca, Vincent, Anthony, Jennifer, Frank, Norma. We did this together. "Still," Daniel said with a grin, "not bad for a guy who got fired by his label." George laughed. "Not fired. Released to pursue other opportunities. Is that what we're calling it?" "That's what we're calling it." As the years continued, George Strait's career followed its own trajectory. Not the meteoric rise of a pop crossover star, but the steady building of a respected artist with a devoted following. He never achieved mainstream superstardom in the way MCA had envisioned, but he achieved something perhaps more valuable: lasting relevance and genuine respect. His children grew up watching their father live his values, understanding that success meant different things to different people. Jennifer eventually became a music teacher, passing on her love of authentic country to the next generation. George Jr. chose a different path, but he carried with him the lesson his father had taught: stay true to yourself, even when it's difficult. Norma remained his anchor through everything, the steady presence that made all the risks worthwhile. Their marriage deepened, not despite the struggles, but through them, strengthened by shared commitment to values over convenience. The band stayed together for over a decade, creating 8 albums that documented both their musical evolution and their unwavering commitment to traditional country. When they eventually went their separate ways, Rebecca to teach at Berkeley, Vincent to produce young artists, Anthony to session work on his own terms, Daniel to focus on songwriting, it was with pride in what they'd built together. Jennifer became one of Nashville's most sought-after songwriters, her distinctive voice influencing country music in ways both obvious and subtle. She never forgot that night at Tootsie's when a stranger had believed in her songs enough to take a chance. Frank Sullivan continued producing select projects until his retirement at 75, always choosing artists who valued authenticity over commercial compromise. His work with George Strait was considered some of his finest, a fitting capstone to a legendary career. And George himself, he kept making music, kept touring, kept telling true stories about real people. Some years were better than others commercially, but the core remained constant: honesty, tradition, and connection with audiences who valued substance over style. On the 20th anniversary of that first Ryman show, George returned to the venue for a special performance. The now legendary Ryman Rebellion, as music historians had started calling it, was recognized as a pivotal moment when traditional country reasserted its relevance. Standing on that stage once more, older but still vital, George looked at the faces in the crowd, some who'd been there 20 years ago, others discovering his music for the first time, and felt profound gratitude. Not for fame or fortune, though he'd achieved a comfortable measure of both. Gratitude for the journey itself, for the people who'd shared it, for the music they'd made together. 20 years ago, I stood on this stage, not knowing if I'd have a career the next week, George said, his voice carrying clearly through the familiar acoustics. Tonight, I'm standing here knowing that the choice I made, to be true to myself, to honor tradition, to trust that authenticity still mattered, was the right one. Not because it made me rich or famous, but because it let me make music I'm proud of, with people I respect, for audiences who appreciate it. That's all any artist can ask for. The applause was thunderous, sustained, filled with the kind of emotional recognition that transcends simple appreciation. This was a moment of shared history, a celebration not just of one man's career, but of everyone who'd ever chosen the harder right over the easier wrong. As George launched into Unwound, still a crowd favorite after all these years, he felt the circle complete. From that desperate meeting at MCA to this triumphant return, the journey had been worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt. He'd proven what he set out to prove, that traditional country music mattered, that audiences still hungered for authenticity. that an artist could succeed on their own terms. The band, some original members, some new faces, provided the perfect support, their musicianship honoring tradition while never sounding dated. The songs still resonated because the truths they told were timeless, and the audience's response proved that good music, honestly made, would always find its people. When the final notes faded and George took his bow, he wasn't just acknowledging applause. He was honoring everyone who'd taken the journey with him, everyone who'd believed when believing was difficult, everyone who'd chosen authenticity over approval. Backstage afterward, surrounded by family, friends, and fellow musicians, George raised a glass. "To the road less traveled," he said. "May we always have the courage to take it." And in that moment, celebrating not an ending, but another milestone in an ongoing journey, George Strait knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice. They'd told him to follow the basics, to compromise, to chase trends. Instead, he'd responded with an epic interpretation of what country music could be, and changed the game in the process. The story of George Strait's stand for traditional country became legend, inspiring generations of artists to trust their instincts and honor their roots. But more than that, it reminded everyone who heard it that authenticity matters, that art shouldn't be compromised for commerce, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply be yourself. 20 years after that pivotal Ryman performance, as George drove home through the Texas night, he reflected on how one decision, one moment of choosing integrity over expedience, had shaped not just his career, but his entire life. The road had been longer and harder than the alternative, but it had led exactly where it needed to go. And that, George thought, as he pulled into his driveway where Norma waited with the porch light on, was the greatest success of all.